Hello everybody and welcome to this edition of Inside Insurance. Today we're going to have a special focus on the personal injuries environment in Ireland. My name is Jean Ray and I'm your host for the series, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Rosalind Caroll. Rosalind is currently the Chief Executive of the Personal Injuries Resolution Board. That is the state agency which resolves personal injury claims without the need for litigation. The idea is that it's better for victims of accidents, but also better for society more broadly as well. She also sits in a number of boards, including as a non-executive director of an approved housing body. Prior to that, she has over 20 years' experience working in the housing sector. She's a former chief executive of the Residential Tenancies Board. That's the state's regulator for the rental sector. Previous roles also include head of regulation of approved housing bodies at the Housing Agency, and she also worked in the Department of the Environment, Community and Local Government, now known as the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, of course. And there she worked in the areas of housing policy, housing finance policy and delivery. She also worked in housing in Dublin City Council for a number of years. So Rosalind, thanks very, very much for joining me today. It's absolutely great to have you with us. Huge amount to talk about in the space, so I'm sure there's lots of topics we'll touch on. But I suppose to start, it might be useful just to give the audience joining us today just a little bit of background on the Personal Injuries Resolution Board.
Yeah, and you've given a good description of us there. So we were established, it's actually our 20-year anniversary this year. So we were established about 20 years ago to stop litigation needlessly going into the courts and to see if we could resolve claims sooner. We deal with motor liability claims, employer liability claims and public liability claims. And actually last year we also took on the Garda Compensation Scheme, which is a compensation scheme for guards injured through the course of their work. And what we try and do, I suppose, is assess claims in terms of putting a quantum, in terms of compensation on a claim without them going to court. And we also have a new service, a mediation service, which allows people to discuss what's happened to them, the injury. Both parties, being the respondent and the claimant, can kind of get into issues of a broader nature than they might do in our pure assessment service. And we also have a research function now, which is very important. So every claim in Ireland, if it hasn't been settled directly with the insurer, must come to the Injuries Resolution Board. And that means we have a view on claims, all across all of those channels of litigation or categories of claims that I talked to earlier. So that gives us a really good view on what's happening in the overall personal injuries environment. And we're trying to now utilise that, I suppose, to help with the insurance market overall and I suppose the overall pricing of of premiums in Ireland.
Yeah, so you touched on the research function there and I suppose transparency around the data. I suppose one of the recent publications was the awards, the award values report, and I suppose I had a read of it myself and a lot of insightful information in there around frequency, heads of damage, changes and so on. Can you just touch maybe on some of the key takeaways from that report?
Yeah, so while we will talk about the average awards, my biggest thing that I continually try to talk about is the change in volumes. We are in a completely different environment to pre-COVID. And I know we're a long way out from COVID, but when you look at the personal injuries environment in Ireland, it's one of the areas that volumes have not come back in. So when COVID happened, as you can imagine, there's no cars on the road, people aren't in pubs and restaurants. What we saw is claim volumes come down very significantly in Ireland. What this report is saying is that has continued that trend. We haven't seen a bounce back. And so what it is showing is a small increase in claims over the periods that it's looking at. So we're looking at awards for the first half of 2023 in the most recent report. But I can give you a bit of insight into kind of the latter half. And overall, last year, awards went up by 10%. But overall, we're still 35% down on volume than where we would have been previously. Now, if you put that into context, what does that mean for Ireland? It means the overall amount of claims that we're giving out is far less. And the reason from that isn't because of COVID, it's because things have started to change. And I know we'll probably have a chat about the guidelines, but that is one of the big things that started to change is we're not seeing the same type of claims come into us. Minor claims aren't being made, so for more minor injuries aren't coming into us. So that's one of the big takeaways of the report. The second then, I suppose, because that profile of claims is changing, we have for the first time started publishing median values as opposed to just average values, because if you look at the portfolio of claims, what you're finding is that actually, as I said, that portfolio, we have a lot of higher value claims coming into us that we wouldn't have had before. They would have gone straight into the litigation channel. So that's a great thing, again, for Ireland Inc., if we think about it, because those claims aren't moving into a more expensive channel. They're being settled earlier at a much lesser cost. So what that median value is coming back and telling us is that claims are 39% lower in value than they would have been vis-a-vis 2020. So huge change in the actual value of claims coming through, and a consistency in that as well is what that report is showing us. There are other elements that you're starting to see in terms of what other kind of changes in injuries maybe that we're starting to see come through since those guidelines came in. One of them that has probably attracted more attention than others is for psychological injuries or psychological damage claims. And they have gone up so that, you know, we now have account for 1 in every 8 assessments has psychological injury versus 1 in 20 in 2021. And that can sound alarming, but there's 2 things to think about that. One, the first thing is we were never able to take wholly psychological claims before the guidelines came out because we didn't have a quantum to put against them, and there wasn't enough court judgments out there to help us then say, well, that's the right value for claims of that nature. We now have that because the guidelines are in place. So in some ways, we're not, again, comparing apples with oranges, or apples with apples, should I say. We're comparing apples with oranges, so to speak. So, and then the other issue is that while that figure is alarming, what we know, even looking at 2024 now, even though the report doesn't cover that, is that number has started to plateau. So we aren't overly concerned about it. It's probably part of the trends of the world that it is. Plus, all we hear about these days is well-being, and you know, so in some ways you'd expect to see.
Surprising in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
It's interesting, and you touched on the injuries guidelines, or the PIGs, as we sometimes refer to them. So I suppose they've been implemented a few years now, and I suppose 2 questions really. Firstly, just your views on progress, but secondly, I think you touched on maybe the central bank and some of their publications as well around NCID, which I suppose does similar analysis in terms of settlement channel and impacts there. It mentions, you know, significant savings, I think, observed on the direct and claims settled through PIAB, but maybe a little bit to go, and uncertainty around the litigated channels. So interested in your views on some of that as well.
Yeah, I suppose 2024 has been a massive year for the guidelines, and even though they came out 3 years ago, I think it's probably fair to say that the impact has maybe been slower to see over the number of years, and there's still been a little bit of trepidation about people going, well, how far are the guidelines going to go, and are they going to be seen and being consistent all the way through the courts, and that kind of fear, I think, has probably still been there. And we've had a lot of litigation, particularly the Injuries Resolution Board has been part of that, and the state, where there's been challenges to the guidelines themselves and the constitutionality of them, and a number of judicial reviews ongoing. We have had a test case, I suppose, running through the system over the last couple of years, but the Supreme Court case found in April that the guidelines were constitutional. The lead judge, or the judge that was kind of doing most of the interpretation of the judgments, because they were very, very complicated, you know, described the judgment as systemic in nature. And I think that's a really fair way of putting it. Having a Supreme Court case now say that the guidelines are lawful is a game changer, and I think probably puts a bit more momentum back into that idea of the guidelines being a game changer. So I think firstly that's hugely momentous, and what we've seen since then is a few more cases coming through the courts, which probably are much more aligned to what we would see in the guidelines as they are published. And the other systemic thing that kind of was mentioned, or, you know, within that judgment, was some commentary on when you can depart from the guidelines, which has been another maybe area that I think has been observed a lot by the industry as to how far people would stray away from what's in that guidelines. And the judges very helpfully said, a number of them, that it really is only in exceptional circumstances that you move away, and it must be justified. So that really means that the guidelines, which are now clarified as law and must be applied by us as well as the courts, should bring about that consistency. What the NCID then, if we go back to the NCID, tells us is that there's a long time between when we do an award and when an award goes the whole way through the litigation system. In fact, what we're talking about, if it's in the motor channel, is 5.2 years if it's going all the way through the litigation system, and we're back over here at about 2.7 years. And to clarify, that's from the date of accident as opposed to us dealing with the claim for that length of time. But there is a huge difference in the timelines. And that has meant that there has been, I suppose, a reluctance, and we don't have as much data as you'd want coming from the full litigation system. Saying that, there's a couple of things that I think are important. The first is that our acceptance rates are up again. So the report that we talked about there showed an acceptance rate of about 48%. So that's respondents and claimants coming together. That's the overall average of them saying, yes, we'll accept the award at your level. That's now gone up to 50.5%, but let's just go with 50% for 2024 so far. So, and that's kind of nearly where it was at 51% before the guidelines came in. So that's 50% of cases that are accepted that are not entering the litigation system. So, and they're being accepted at the values that are 39% less, and you don't have any of the systemic costs of the legal costs and everything else going with them. So I think that's a really important issue. The second issue is, and the NCID's report is very good at showing us how many cases actually go to court. An awful lot of cases don't go to court. So in the motor channel, it tends to be about 2% of cases. In the public liability, employer liability, it's about 3 to 4% of cases. So those cases are not going to court. That means they're being settled by the insurers themselves. And I suppose what we would hope is happening within that channel is that the guidelines are being used to settle them. And I suppose one of the other things that I go back to my volume thing that's maybe being lost, if we just keep measuring the average award or the median award, we're losing sight of the fact that the volumes have gone hugely down, 35% down in volumes. So we've gone from giving out awards back in 2019 on average about 270 million in the total value of what we gave out to 170, 175 million. So very, very different. And that's 100 million less. So you can't just discount that. And I think that's maybe just... that context is probably lost a little bit, and that's maybe just... so the reports are hugely valuable, but that's just a piece that we would like to see more commentary on.
Bringing through the frequency on the average cost. That's very sensible, I think, so you've touched on a lot of, I suppose, positivity, I suppose, over the last few years, and trying to keep that momentum. I suppose, what do you see as some of the, I suppose, challenges on the horizon over the next few years?
So everybody backing where we're at, and that's why I used the word about the Supreme Court cases and having that momentum again, because people maybe were a bit concerned about court rulings and other things. We now have full clarity on the guidelines, and what I would love to see, but it is a challenge for everybody working, is everybody applying to that consistency and backing that consistency, and with that some transparency around that. So we don't have a clear view on the settlement channels, and I think that is a challenge in terms of then gaining trust from the other side of the house. So if you remember, like, we have a claimant there wondering whether to accept our award or whether to move and go into the litigation system. The more transparent and open that we can be about that, the more people are going to trust the systems that are in front of them. So there, I think, challenges that we've definitely improved on, but probably need to keep working on. I do think we're in a far more transparent environment than we were many years ago. And the NCID and insurers themselves have been much better in terms of providing information, but that piece, I think, we continue to need to get better at. The other big challenge for us, I suppose, if I look at our organisation, and I mentioned the 20 years that we've been around, I think it's fair to say that when we were originally established, that it was thought we would take more out of the litigation channel than we have been able to. So huge focus of our organisation now is well, what can we do to resolve a claim, and looking at the outcome rather than the process or the outputs that we're delivering. And the mediation service that we've introduced with the help of our Minister and the Department of Enterprise, Minister Cleary, but it's hugely significant for that to work. A lot of our cases that don't enter into the system are lost because people think they're going to fight the good fight on maybe liability grounds, and it's going to go all the way to the courts. But we know through the statistics that I just mentioned that they're not going into the court system. But we did have a very black and white system. So if you came into us and just said, yes, we'd like you to assess the claim and we're happy as a respondent for you to assess the claim, all we were doing then is looking at the medical evidence, the evidence around loss of earnings and other things, and then trying to put a value on the claim, having regard to the personal injury guidelines, and before that the Book of Quantum. Hugely valuable service, and we have taken a huge amount of cases out of the litigation through that. But for some people and for some parties on both claimant and respondent side, they needed to trash out more than just value of the claim, and they needed to maybe look at whether there was a little bit of contributing negligence, or they might have wanted to discuss whether they needed further treatments, the extent of the injury, whether there had been previous accidents, and it's not as black and white as maybe the system had allowed for. So it's a huge opportunity for us to allow, rather than wait 3 or 4 years for that to happen, to allow that to happen now earlier. So we're in very early days of it. We now have mediation open for public liability and employer liability. We'll have it for motor by the end of the year. But we are seeing some good trends already coming for it, coming through the system. And I suppose the biggest challenge for me in running the Injuries Resolution Board is to keep that focus on how do we resolve, and then for people to trust the system. And I suppose that's why we're here today.
To try and get some of the messages out. You touched on in some areas of focus just there on the mediation, I suppose, and the 20-year anniversary. So I suppose over the next 5, is there anything extra to add in terms of some of the key areas of focus that you'll have? Yeah,
well, we've also mentioned the research. I think we have a duty as a public body that's independent, that's sitting on this data, to start using it in a way that can help. And that can help hopefully bring competition, brings transparency, all of those things that I talked about. But also there's really useful pieces there in terms of prevention, I think, as well. So, you know, when we look at all the deaths and fatalities that are unfortunately happening on the roads, there's lots of agencies that can work together, and we're one of them that have a lot of data that can help and bring clarity to that. Like, we know that our number of fatalities last year went up, as would you see in terms of the other trends, but we also know that the large majority of people that suffered through fatalities were vulnerable road users. So how can we use that data to then start working on that? The other key area for us is trying to get to a point where we've only started our research function in the last we're up and running about a year or so on research, but developing that to kind of get into the sub-market area, so that bringing the data down to more granular levels. So we will be bringing out our public liability report probably before the end of the year. I reckon it'll be out in October, November. And that's really important in terms of, yes, it'll give you the overall data on public liability, but we are starting to then try and dip in from a qualitative perspective into some areas. So one area in particular would be, we've looked at creches and childcare, because it's an area where availability and cost of insurance is constantly cited as an issue. And again, we're just in that period where kids are going back to school, cost of childcare back up on the agenda again. And I suppose I'm again looking at us as a public body, what can we do to help and serve that purpose? And we know from looking at that, and like we'll see when the report comes out, that actually the number and frequency of accidents there is far less when you look at the actual number of children attending areas like that. So we would hope that the transparency of that data will help inform availability and pricing within that market, and maybe newcomers coming in.
Yeah, that'd be very welcome, I think, some competition, So, I suppose we've touched on a lot today. I suppose if there was, one key thing you'd like the audience to take from today, what would that be?
I'll go back to my mediation, because we're at the start of that, and the opt-in levels actually, surprisingly, from the legal side of the house are quite strong, given it's so new, and we're up to between 35% to 40% of the cases coming in the legal community or the claimant, if they're directly with us, are opting into mediation. It's surprisingly, however, on the insurance side, that has been slower. So we're only at 17% opt-in there for mediation from our respondents as well. So there's huge opportunity. Yeah. The type of cases that we're getting resolved there are ranging from fractures to we have somebody who has had partial loss of a finger, very serious injuries. And so far the agreement rate, once you get in there, is hitting 50%. So and the time that we're resolving those in is 4 months on average. So if you think about that in terms of the claimant coming away and having a fair and just award, but 2, the systemic costs. So when we keep looking at average and median awards, we're actually losing sight of the fact that it costs 17,000 to go into litigation system, more than maybe €1,000, €800 on our side of the house. But if you bring that into PL and EL, public liability and employer liability, it's 35,000 is the average legal costs. So the systemic cost savings, it's not just about the personal injury guidelines. The only way we're going to get real change is to change both. And to do that, we need more people to be open to resolving claims earlier and using the tools that we now have available.
Yeah. Well, best of luck with all of that. It's a full agenda for the next few years. And thanks for joining me as well today. It was really great having you with us. And thanks everybody for joining us today. As usual, if any of the issues discussed today resonated with you, please feel free to reach out to myself or your usual KPMG contact. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.